I was hired by the government of Sardara to work in the archaeological site at the Church of Sant'Anastasia in Sardara, to dig up the skeletons of giants. The bones of giants were buried among the Nuraghe ruins and tombs beneath the Church of Sant'Anastasia. We even discovered two dead giants embracing each other. They were complete skeletons. The larger one was over 9 feet tall. I measured it with an architect from Milan. Whenever we found the bones of giants, we would carry them into the church. Everything went into the church. The bones, the artifacts, everything. We would arrange them on a large table inside of the church. There were bones of both normal-sized people and giants. Every day, that table would be full of artifacts. The bones of the giants were enormous. Hands, feet, and skulls 3 or 4 times the size of ours. But everything would disappear overnight. The next day, there would be nothing left. Everything would just disappear. It was always like that. As soon as we would find something, the next day everything would be gone. And we never knew where that stuff went.
We have discovered that legends are often shadows of the truth, dark silhouettes that paint the contours of historical fact. Much like dry riverbeds carved into the desert floor, if we follow them carefully, they can lead us to the fountains of their biblical genesis.
Footprints of history's true legends have led us to the desert southwest of the United States, where our path has converged with Tom Horn, a fellow researcher who has been investigating the mysterious disappearance of the Anasazi Indians. To pick up the trail of the Anasazi, we would have to explore the last traces of their ancient civilization in the high mesas of Colorado and New Mexico. The Anasazi were an ancient people that flourished in the Four Corners region of the United States for thousands of years, until something drove them into the cliffs of the canyons and they disappeared. The official story says that the Anasazi simply migrated out of the region because of drought. But the fortresses they built in the cliffs before their sudden disappearance suggest something much more gruesome may have happened. Legend records that giants devoured them all.
Our third generation medicine man made the point that if we would have asked his grandfather why they would have gone through such Herculean efforts to move all this debris, right? They had to bring all of this from way down in the valley up here to build this edifice. It was because a portal opened, a doorway, and the giants came up out of the earth. And around the same time that Moses is on the other side of the world writing in, there were giants in the earth in those days. So it was a testament that they were trying to build something here to defend themselves from against something that was incredible, astonishing.
My name is Clifford Mahudi. I am a Zuni Pueblo elder. There were giants according to our Zuni history and legends, and of course it became mythology. And there was a lot of references to that in other systems, such as the medicine societies, in all the rituals that we used to go through. And there has been many stories about it. First of all, is one of the ones that I remember very well is that they actually used to live underground. And this is where they supposedly live, is in the what we call the underworld. It's not what we consider the fourth world, but it's the underworld system that they come out of at certain times. So the giant people were around here, and also that they would migrate to other Pueblo people in their domains at that time. And one of the things that I learned when I used to go up to the Paiute Nation was they actually had some red-headed giants that are buried up there. I have a friend that is like a mountain climber type person. He goes out there and collects a lot of ancient stuff out there in the desert. And he talks about the burial places of the red-headed giants. And he doesn't talk up to anybody because he knows that if they found out, they're going to take those bones. And in the past, usually the museums took them and they disappeared.
The greatest cover-up in history is the cover-up of history. And in the United States, no other organization has covered up more history than the Smithsonian Institution. Based in Washington, D.C. and funded primarily by the federal government, the Smithsonian Institution has exhumed, confiscated, and sequestered thousands of out-of-place artifacts in America since the year of its founding in 1846. Originally established by its founder, James Smithson, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, the institution was quickly hijacked in its early years by Darwinist doctrinaires, who turned it into a propaganda machine for the theories of evolution and isolationism. Isolationism is an anthropological doctrine which asserts that ancient American societies were isolated from the outside world and delegitimizes the notion that foreign cultures had contact or influence in pre-Columbia America. One of the greatest proponents of isolationism was a man by the name of John Wesley Powell, who became director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution in the late 1800s. Under Powell's direction, any artifacts discovered in America that contradicted the theories of evolution and isolationism were either destroyed or concealed in the vaults of the institution.
Powell had a proclivity of trying to obfuscate any language that directly referred to giants. The discovery of giants in early American history, redundantly by different universities, left the Smithsonian in a position of needing to control the flow of information. And they obviously wouldn't have liked that the discovery of giant bones supported the biblical narrative and not the Darwinian narrative.
Lake Powell and the rivers that fed it were named after John Wesley Powell. Now, John Wesley Powell is the guy that ran the Smithsonian, and he had a problem. He couldn't accept the fact that people prior to his discovery were incredibly advanced seafarers. So when John Wesley Powell took over the Smithsonian and started heading it up, there was a real attempt to hide anything that was an out-of-place artifact, which is called an OOPArt, O-O-P-A-R-T.
At the turn of the 19th century, the agents of the Smithsonian Institution were confronted with a vexing dilemma. On the one hand, the institution's official dogma was Darwinism and isolationism. But on the other hand, out-of-place artifacts and the bodies of giants, in some cases with red hair and arrayed in ornate copper armor, were turning up all over the United States, especially in the mounds.
Americans today know almost nothing about the mystery of the mound builders, but in early America was a hot topic of the day. At one time, the landscape of the eastern United States was dotted with thousands of artificial mounds. What made the mounds so fascinating in the minds of the early Americans was what could be found buried inside of them. They were filled with strange artifacts and bones, including the bones of the giants.
That giants were buried in the mounds of America was an undisputed reality in the 1800s. Even Abraham Lincoln, while waxing poetically about Niagara Falls in some lecture notes, assumes the fact to be commonly known.
From the late 1800s through the early 1900s, universities across the United States and our own independent Indiana Jones types were taking to the mounds and doing excavations, and quite often giant bones were being discovered and unearthed. And there are literally dozens and dozens of newspaper articles from reputable sources from the late 1800s through the 1900s discussing the discovery of giants 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall. One of them that I read, 12 feet tall.
So prevailing was the question of the mound builders in the late 19th century that in 1881, Congress commissioned the Smithsonian Institution to conduct a widespread archaeological investigation of the mounds, which essentially granted the institution exclusive control over all mound excavations and subsequently the artifacts buried within them.
And so they took control of the excavations away from many of the independent universities and sent in their own teams. They even called it the mound excavation teams, specifically targeting the American Indian mounds where many of the bones of the giants were being discovered.
The excavation teams tore through the mounds with great haste. In just 9 years, 2,000 of them were unearthed, and tens of thousands of artifacts were carted off to the Smithsonian's repositories. They destroyed as much as they discovered in their rush to preempt any more civilian excavations and to confiscate the artifacts and bones that flew in the face of the institution's sanctioned narrative of American history.
Ultimately, in accordance with Powell's doctrine, and despite many of the artifacts testifying to the contrary, the mound builders were officially declared to be ordinary indigenous peoples of the Americas. No further explanation was furnished by the Smithsonian Institution as to why six-fingered giants with red hair arrayed in copper armor, among other oddities, were sometimes discovered in the mounds. The case was closed. Powell's doctrine prevailed, even as the vaults of the Smithsonian were packed with artifacts that categorically debunked his worldview.
And many of the findings of the Smithsonian, which included people of extraordinary height and size, are still documentable to this day, even from the Smithsonian's own reports. For instance, the following is a brief list of documented findings, all recorded in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution in 1875. Item 1, one skull measuring 36 inches in circumference. Item 2, one full skeleton with double rows of teeth buried alongside a gigantic axe, referred to in the report as a gigantic savage. Another part of that same report, giant axes and skinning stones, one weighing over 15 pounds, that had an ornately carved handle and was of such mass that it documented only a giant could have wielded this. Another jawbone that easily slipped completely around the entire face of a large man during the Smithsonian recording. And then there's the 5th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian, where they document 10 more skeletons buried in a mass grave, giant skeletons. And then in the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in 1894, where it documents 2 enormous skulls, several baffling femur bones, and 17 full giant skeletons that were recorded. Now, these are all documents that are still available. And so if one were to say, well, you're only reciting the conspiracy theory about the cover-up of giant bones that were excavated under the Smithsonian, no, these are actually in their own reports. So we do know that even though the Powell Doctrine was in place and there was an intentional effort to obfuscate the language around the recovery of giants, that indeed this was happening in early American history, and it is part of the record.
The mounds were not the only problem for the institution. All over America, from coast to coast, well into the 20th century, newspapers were reporting the discovery of giants and other out-of-place artifacts. Some of the most sensational stories were coming out of the Grand Canyon, a region that John Wesley Powell had personally explored on several expeditions. Rumors of hidden treasure troves, Egyptian and Tibetan artifacts, and giant mummies were appearing in articles across the nation. In 1909, the Phoenix Gazette published an article detailing the incredible finds of a Smithsonian-funded expedition led by Professor G.E. Kincaid, who allegedly discovered vast amounts of Egyptian-like treasure in hidden caverns and passageways in the canyon. According to the article, the treasure mysteriously vanished, and today, all records of the Kincaid expedition have been expunged from the archives of the Smithsonian Institution.
We discovered that there was one event in which Powell actually became angry and defensive concerning a discovery that was made inside of the Grand Canyon. He wrote this in a letter to the Smithsonian. He wrote, "Evidence of these so-called ancient giants' migration from one territory to another cannot be mapped until we can study how the planes of the earth have shifted since the migration, and these studies should only be carried out through purely geologic and paleontologic evidence. We cannot intelligently discuss potential giants until their home has been discovered, and further, until the geology of the people is so thoroughly known that the different phases of its geography can be presented."
In truth, what many of the artifacts sequestered by the Smithsonian Institution had proven was that a non-indigenous race of giants migrated to the Americas in the very distant past. Theirs was an advanced culture, adept in the working of copper and other metals, beyond the capability of the Native Americans, and displaying genetic markers much more akin to the Canaanites of biblical fame. The question that vexed John Wesley Powell and the institution at large was not, was there a race of giants inhabiting pre-Columbia America, but rather, where did they come from? The answer to this question may reside on an enigmatic island in the Mediterranean Sea, where a Smithsonian-like cover-up has been ongoing for decades and is still in full force today: the island of Sardinia.
The island of Sardinia is located in the Mediterranean Sea just south of Corsica and west of the Italian peninsula. During the age of the Roman Empire, Sardinia was home to Roman colonies and governed by Roman prefects, but little is known about the history of the island before the Roman occupation. What is known is that an ancient race of megalith builders called the Nuragic civilization once inhabited Sardinia thousands of years ago. The Nuragic civilization is shrouded in mystery and legend. No one knows exactly who they were, But the ruins of their megalithic towers called Nuraghi bear witness that they were mighty builders. Nuraghi towers were constructed with large, uncut stones in the Cyclopean style without the use of mortar. Some of the towers were relatively small, while others were astonishingly large, rising over 100 feet into the air. There are over 7,000 ruined Nuraghi towers still standing in Sardinia today. But archaeologists estimate that at one time there were more than 30,000 of them all over the island.
Everywhere you go in Sardinia, you find the ruins of the Nuraghi towers and the stone rubble belonging to other megalithic constructions that once populated the landscape. Having traveled extensively all over the island, I am amazed that so little attention has been given to this place by archaeologists, considering how anomalous it is in regards to the sheer quantity of megaliths that were once present. But even more remarkable than the abundance of megaliths is the abundance of evidence pointing to the unassailable reality that Sardinia was once inhabited by a race of giants.
Originally, there were apparently 30,000 Nuraghi all over the island. Now the estimation of the Nuraghi is approximately 7,000 to 8,000 around Sardinia. These towers were the expression of the megalithic architecture, which is also called Cyclopean. The legends mention Cyclops who built these megalithic structures around the island. They might have been very impressive and imposing in those times, because when the Nuraghi were first built, the single tower could reach even 28-30 meters height. It was like a skyscraper of the prehistory. And Cyclopean because of the legend, as if they were built by cyclops or giants, but also because of the use of massive boulders, of massive stones, which were set in circles with no use of mortar binding. It must have been really hard to lift them, to move these stones, and even today engineers wouldn't know how to build this type of constructions anymore.
According to the Greeks, the Cyclopes were the one-eyed offspring of the gods, who were famed as gifted craftsmen and masons. The Greeks credited the giant Cyclops with building the megalithic construction found in Greece and throughout the Mediterranean. The Greek historian Pausanias recorded that the walls of Mycenae and Tiryns and Peloponnesus were built by the Cyclops in ages past. Clans of Cyclopes were rumored to inhabit the islands of the Mediterranean. In his epic poem, The Odyssey, Homer recounts the harrowing voyage of Odysseus, king of Ithaca. During his wanderings in the Mediterranean Sea, Odysseus and his crew enter a cave on the island of the Cyclops, where they encounter Polyphemus, a savage one-eyed giant. Polyphemus devours some of Odysseus's men before they put his eye out with a spear and escape the island. In the next chapter of the story, Odysseus and his men are carried in a storm to a place called Laestrygonia, which is a land inhabited by cannibalistic giants. The giants devour many of Odysseus's crew and destroy all but one of his ships.
The Odyssey is obviously a work of fiction, not to be taken literally. But like many of the legends composed by the ancient Greeks, it may be laced with historical fact. The mystery schools and fraternities of builders throughout history have utilized the insignia of the cycloptic eye in its many motifs to communicate knowledge originating from a celestial source. The single orbed eye, open and watching, invokes the Watchers who descended to the earth and the antediluvian age, the forbidden knowledge, and their hybrid offspring. The Cyclops is the embodiment of these concepts. But was the Cyclops more than an esoteric symbol to the ancients? Was it a real flesh and blood creature? In Sardinia, many believe it was, citing the small island of Sant'Antioco in the southernmost province, known as the Island of the Cyclops.
My name is Paolo Valdez. I was born in Sant'Antioco in 1944. When I was young, I explored a lot in the mountains. And so I saw many skeletons among the ruins and the old houses in the countryside. One day, when I was 8 years old, I was grazing oxen in the mountains. There was a nuraghe nearby, so I decided to go and explore it. I went inside of the nuraghe and discovered the giant skeleton of a man partially buried in the ground. When I looked at the skull, I noticed that he had only one eye socket in the middle of his forehead. Instead of two eyes, like a normal man, he only had one. He was very large. I could see his feet sticking out of the ground. He was much larger than a regular-sized man. And this happened in the area known as the Land of the Cyclops.
Sant'Antioco lends credence to the Greek stories of Cyclopes in the Mediterranean. Not only are there ancient folkloric accounts of the Cyclops inhabiting this region of Sardinia, there are also contemporary claims that the skeletal remains of cycloptic giants were unearthed some years ago in plain view of the townspeople before being secreted away with threats of violence if anyone dared speak of it. Many of the people we spoke with in Sant'Antioco affirmed that they had heard of the incident, but were unwilling to go on camera. Some even told us that the Cyclopes were exhumed right in the middle of town, where the megalithic remains of an archaeological excavation can still be seen. I had no way to confirm if these rumors were true, but what I can confirm is that highly secretive and restricted excavations are still taking place in Sant'Antioco today. We were able to film one such area where some believe that the graves of giants had been discovered and were being disentombed. Could it be that the legends of giants and cyclopes in Sardinia are true? Are their remains being exhumed in secret and then hidden away to protect the conventional narrative of history and the institutions that propagate it? The answer is self-evident for those who have seen the bones.
My name is Luigi Muscas. I am 53 years old and I live in Poli Albarei. I've been immersed in the ancient history of the giants of Sardinia ever since I was a little boy. It was handed down to me by my relatives. The first skeleton I ever saw, the first mummy I ever saw, was on a rainy day in the countryside of Poli Albarei. I was out grazing my father's sheep in the fields near the ancient ruins, when suddenly it started to rain. I got caught in a violent thunderstorm. I looked for a shelter among the ruins to get out of the rain, and I found a small stone doorway leading into a megalithic tomb buried in a hillside. When I crawled inside of it, I found the body of a dead giant. He was huge, more than 10 feet long. He was mummified and well preserved. His skin was the same color as mine. He had all his teeth. None one of them was missing. I counted them. There were 32. I wasn't even surprised to find him there. It only confirmed what my relatives had always told me. We were the descendants of the giants. He had a huge head. His legs were this thick. and there was still skin covering the whole body. And even the tendons were still there, the tendons connecting to the fingers. I told my friend about it, and we came back together to play with the giant. We used to joke around with his fingers and make them move by pulling on the tendons in his arm. We had fun pretending he was still alive. We played with the giants for a couple of weeks, until they took him away. As you can clearly see, this is all that remains. These ruins were left because I stopped the excavators. They wanted to plant trees, like those trees over there. They wanted to destroy everything. The tombs, the pyramid, the other step pyramid over there, and part of the nuraghi. They wanted to destroy all of this, to plant trees and provide work for the youth. But it was just an excuse to cover up this history. So that day I was eating, and I felt compelled to leave my house and rush up here. I didn't know why I was coming, but it happens like that for me. When I feel I have to go, I go. And so I drove here with my car. I was speeding like crazy to get up here. When I got here, I stopped the excavators who were destroying everything. I told them, stop, and they stopped. They were under specific orders from the authorities to get rid of everything, because these are the last ruins of this lost city, of this history, and they wanted to eliminate it so that nothing would be left.
While we were filming around Pauli Albarei, one of the town officials pulled up in his car and was watching us from a distance with a look of consternation on his face. He made a cell phone call before driving away. As soon as we got up to the hillside where the tombs are, a helicopter appeared on the horizon and hovered around the area until we left.
Here in this country, the legends of the giants still get passed down. The legend of the lost civilization. But by now the stories are almost forgotten, because many of the elderly in the country have died, and the young people don't really care about our history. So, many of the old people that knew about the giants are dead. Only a few remember the stories, like my mother and Uncle Alfredo.
I was born in Pauli Arbarei on the 28th of October, 1939. We used to ask my father questions when we were plowing the soil, because we would find pieces of femurs or teeth as big as a finger. So we would ask, what are these? Do they belong to animals? And he would say, no, those were big men that used to live in the past. My father used to always say that. The countryside of Pauli Arbarei was full of these skeletons.
When I showed my grandfather the mummy, he told me the whole story about them, how they built the nuraghi, how they built the tombs, the sculptures, everything. Because he inherited the stories from his ancestors. This great civilization was, let's say, was pervasive all over the earth, because we find the same things with the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Mayan civilization, the Inca, the Aztec. In all of the civilizations of the world, there are strong links with the civilization of the giants of Sardinia, because they dominated the entire world. And all of the megaliths in China, in Japan, in Asia, all over the earth, it all comes from the same civilization. Ultimately, this civilization, having rebelled against God, who created everything, was punished and destroyed. This destruction happened in one day and one night, with the overheating of the atmosphere, earthquakes, and with the water that came from the sea and buried everything, all of Sardinia. This was a universal flood. It wasn't only in Sardinia, so everything was buried underground. Why are the nuraghi buried beneath the soil? because the water came and buried them. It caught everyone by surprise. So everything they had is still buried inside the nuraghe. The official story does not tell the truth. But if anyone wants to dig, they can still unearth this history inside the nuraghe, the pyramids and the temples. The seeds to replant this great civilization are still there.
So we are in Barumini, at the archaeological site of Sunuragi, which is a UNESCO site. It is one of the largest nuraghe complex of the island, and it's been excavated deeply in the 50s. Just before it was excavated and investigated, the site looked like one of the many hills which characterize the scenery and the landscape of this interior of the island, of the region called Marmilla. Underneath the mud, the earth of these hills, there are other archaeological sites. In all likelihood, nuraghe, these megalithic buildings of the island.
Many of the largest megalithic edifices on Earth are still buried beneath a layer of sediment that was distributed over the surface of the planet during the Great Flood. As a result, the most massive and mind-blowing antediluvian constructions have yet to be unearthed or even acknowledged because their unbelievable size simply defies the conventional narrative of history. All over Sardinia, there are large mounds of earth covered in stone rubble. Beneath many of these mounds, the ruins of undiscovered nuraghe towers or other megalithic edifices from the antediluvian age are hiding in plain sight. The largest of the nuraghe towers in Sardinia were once thought to be nothing more than natural formations of the landscape before they were unearthed. In the midst of the region known in Sardinian legend as the Lost City, which was said to be the capital of a once great seafaring empire ruled by 10 giant kings, an isolated conical hill rises high into the air. The ruins of a medieval fortress crown the summit, but pale in comparison to the enormous stone edifice rivaling the Great Pyramid of Giza, likely hiding beneath it. The skeptics refer to it as a conical hill, but the elders of the local villages call it an ancient pyramid. Could Sardinia have been the epicenter of a once mighty antediluvian empire? It would have undoubtedly required the resources of a great people to build the tens of thousands of megalithic towers that were once present on the island.